Welcome back, Ultima Weapons. It's the Night Sky Prince again. With each and every piece of news that comes out regarding Final Fantasy VII Remake, we learn more and more about what's going to be required to make the 1997 classic into a modern masterpiece. However, with every bit of news that comes out on these changes, we're always met with some resistance from purists, often stating, how come the game just can't be the same game again with better graphics, voice acting, and proper cutscenes? Of course, in a very surface level of thinking, this sounds like a great idea. The original game is my absolute favorite of all time, as well as millions of other people's across the world. Why change the winning formula to a game that is regarded by so many people as close to perfect? In fact, many people have gone as far as to say Square is setting themselves up for failure, often pointing to games like Crash Bandicoot or Shadow of the Colossus remakes as counterexamples to what Square Enix could have done instead. But honestly, with the challenges that Square Enix faces developing this game, would it really be possible for them to do a one-for-one remake? Well, let's start with the pre-rendered backgrounds. These were an awesome workaround for the limited polygon counts of the early consoles, and are super nostalgic for those of you who grew up during the PlayStation 1 era. However, if we're going to implement proper cutscenes with voice acting, we can no longer use static backgrounds with a camera that is fixed in place. These environments now have to be fully 3D modeled. In fact, due to a combination of extremely old CG files and a loss of data over time, and software that doesn't even properly run on modern PCs, it is next to impossible for Square to re-render these backgrounds again in HD, making a proper remaster a little more than just a distant dream. With pre-rendered backgrounds no longer being used, this means that now every single location in the game has to be completely redesigned. Well, you might be wondering, what do I mean by this? Well, what does the back of Aeris' house look like? Ever notice how everything important is nicely rotated to the front of the camera's view? While this looks perfectly fine with a fixed camera, it's going to look incredibly odd when you walk into a town and most of the doors are facing the exact same way. So even the maps have to be adjusted for proper 3D viewing. The Overworld Map is a huge attraction for many longtime Final Fantasy fans, but even it is subject to change. World maps work essentially by making your character into a proportional giant, allowing them to traverse hundreds or even thousands of miles of land in just seconds. While this way of doing world maps is incredibly nostalgic, the graphical fidelity of Final Fantasy VII Remake, attempting such a realistic and beautifully detailed art style, it would just be more than strange to see. It would actually break the continuity and immersion. So what is the Overworld Map being replaced with? More than likely something similar to Final Fantasy XV's open world, with each volume of Final Fantasy VII Remake containing its own open world. But the consequence of that is that what just looked like a few yards, yes yards, I'm American, is actually several miles of landscape that has to be designed. Dialogue is another massive challenge for Final Fantasy VII Remake. Scenes that used to be simple text boxes appearing on the screen are now going to have to be fully animated, fully voiced cutscenes, or at the very least, much dialogue will have to be party banter. What used to only require a simple script to trigger some blue boxes to appear and tell an emotionally deep story is now going to require several hours of labor to be just as effective. The exact dialogue from the original can't be used again, not even in the Japanese version. While it can and almost definitely will be referenced, things that sounded well written down don't necessarily translate well when they're spoken aloud. This is oftentimes because Final Fantasy VII used some very over-the-top and high contrast types of dialogue to make the script feel more lively, and it worked. But when it comes to actual voice acting, most of it won't translate well at all. Not to mention dozens of new lines they'll have to write for such characters like Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie, as they plan on doing massive content expansions for the backstories of their characters. Of course, it's not just things on the field or dialogue either. Battles are something that have to be completely redone in numerous aspects. For example, let's take enemies. Honestly, there are so many enemies that are just going to look absolutely horrifying in HD. Yeah, with these photorealistic graphics, no thanks. Like the thing of absolute nightmares. This is going to require many of these enemies being entirely reworked, not to mention perhaps even requiring the insertion of some entirely new enemies. Speaking of combat, there's a blaring fact that Final Fantasy VII Remake is no longer going to be a turn-based active time battle game, at least not in the purest state. The producer and former acclaimed director Yoshinori Kitase says that the series no longer at all plans plans to modernize the turn-based battle system for any future mainline entries. And from a business standpoint, that honestly makes a lot of sense. Most of the people who are old enough to remember and have played Final Fantasy VII at its release are in their 30s and 40s now. I'm 26 years old, and honestly, I didn't complete a full playthrough of the game until a few years later. What I'm getting at is, this multi-million-dollar AAA project is not just dedicated to making a bunch of people relive the late 90s for a few brief moments. Final Fantasy VII Remake is not just about recapturing the same audience who played the first game a long time ago. There are many kids who grew up hearing that Final Fantasy VII is one of the most legendary games of all time, and they haven't actually played it. Instead, they were introduced to the series by things like character cameos in Kingdom Hearts, by watching the then visually impressive Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, or playing the PSP prequel Crisis Core. And so of course, when you ask many of them if they're going to play the original FF7 before the remake, they say, well, I'm just going to wait for the remake. All this and more is why Final Fantasy VII had no choice but to take a different approach to combat. The market has changed drastically, and while in 1997 this style of combat was appealing, nowadays it's a much harder sell to a multi-million people audience. After all, many people who picked up Final Fantasy XV for the first time were people who literally said they wanted to try an FF but were turned off by turn-based combat. Yes, it is kind of dumb, though personally I do love turn-based combat, especially ATB. This is the reality of the situation. While people often point to Persona 5's strong sales to indicate there is still a strong market for turn-based, it doesn't necessarily hold up. After all, Persona 5 sold 2 million copies, being on PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4, allowing the game to be playable across 2 generations of consoles. Not including Royal Edition and Windows Edition, Final Fantasy XV is at 7 million in sales just from the console versions alone, with the expected sales of the aforementioned editions to likely push the game near 10 million units by the end of the year or next year. The only other series in the AAA world pushing the numbers on a turn-based game is, well, Pokemon, but that's the Nintendo fandom, and ultimately there's no questioning them. When you look at all these different challenges that Final Fantasy VII Remake must overcome, it's certainly not going to be an easy game for Square Enix to make, and the result of all this is a Final Fantasy VII that has to be completely reinvented. But what do you Ultima Weapons think? Do you have faith they can really pull off this massive project? Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let me know in the comments below. And if you really love Final Fantasy VII, like you got an original Black Label copy and you treat it like a holy relic, be sure to head on over to our Facebook group, Ultima, Square Enix plus JRPGs, where I can't promise you won't get Geostigma, but I can promise you'll have a good time. Link in the description below.